Hi, it's the kid at Red Gaming Tech. I know it's been a while since you've heard from me, but I've decided to jump back into the fray to help Amy and Paul out at this time. It's E3 2017, kind of a lot going on, so I'm going to jump in with a rundown of what was shown, discussed, teased, etc. at the PC Gamer segment of E3 2017. So I'm just going to jump straight in. So, in no particular order, I literally wrote them down in the order I could recall them after the first viewing. So jumping straight in, the first one I noted down was Islands, which is from the developer of Arma and DayZ, so that's Bohemia Interactive. And the first thing that struck me about this particular game was that it's, as I'm sure it probably struck a lot of people, a far different game visually and thematically to what we would normally expect from Bohemia, which is sort of military simulations, and with DayZ, kind of a military zombie survival simulation, I guess you would call it. But what we saw was kind of indistinct visually. It was a bit bland in terms of its presentation. It was very colourful, very bright, and cutesy. But I think because it was also visually indistinct from other games of the genre, especially the Minecraft Terraria with their cartoony, colourful art styles, I think it's kind of got an even bigger risk of falling into that area of white noise, but we'll see. So next up was the sequel to Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War. So there weren't that many details given on the gameplay, other than that they said it's going to fix a lot of the gripes about the original game, and naturally they didn't specify what those gripes were, so we're going to have to just kind of take their word for it on that. I felt like with their presentation, they wanted to emphasize the story above anything else. Visually, it doesn't seem to be a massive leap ahead from Shadow of Mordor, but being kind of a relatively recent game, there's only so much you can improve on that with current technology. But I think it's got potential. I mean, because it's kind of anchored in the Middle Earth sort of lore and setting, there's only so much you can change it from the previous game. So it's not really a complaint to say that it looks too similar to the previous game, because it's kind of inherent that a game in the same universe would look very similar. But as a teaser, it served its purpose. It piqued my interest. I think it's going to be a game to watch for later in the year. So the next game I remembered was maybe a game I remembered for not exactly the best reasons, and that was Wargroove. So in my notes here, I've written this one was a bit of a facepalm, but maybe that's being unfair. The announcer, which I think was a bit harsh on the developers, almost immediately compared the game to Fire Emblem and Advance Wars. And personally, I wouldn't say it was like Advance Wars. It pretty much is Advance Wars, but with a fantasy setting. Now, that may be unfair, and maybe the game is different in ways that weren't really properly shown at the show. But the game is, to all intents and purposes, from what I can see, very, very derivative of Advance Wars. And it kind of felt a bit awkward after the announcer pointed that out, because it's almost like the developers didn't really have a response to that, to say, well, no, it's not like Advance Wars because of X, Y, or Z. They just kind of stood there and took it and almost agreed with him. But it did have some nice features on show. So it had a very tight-looking map editor where you could actually edit the entire campaigns as well as the sub-maps that the missions within that campaign take place on. There's a high level of customizability, whatever. But anyway, I'll move on from that one. It was all a bit unfortunate, really. So next up was quite a larger scale title from Bosky, which is Cliff Bleszinski's current studio, and it's the much publicised LawBreakers. So it looks like it's going to be possibly an unnecessary new contender in what's becoming an increasingly crowded arena shooter genre. It kind of has strong vibes of Overwatch and Titanfall, which I guess to a degree all arena shooters do, and they just happen to be some of the most successful ones. What encourages me is Cliff Bleszinski obviously has quite a strong pedigree with that genre, given his past with Epic Games and Unreal Tournament Quake and Unreal Tournament around similar times, but kind of the originators of that sort of arena shooter genre. I mean, Unreal Tournament was it necessarily more popular than Quake? I think they were technically different time periods, but the multiplayer aspect of them is obviously very similar. So you have a set of distinct characters and unique abilities, much like a lot of other arena shooters. But the emphasis is kind of in how each character moves around the map and the angles of attack that they are afforded by their individual abilities. Graphically, it looks incredible. It's running on the Unreal Engine 4. I mean, that's to be expected, really, of such a large studio. It was pretty much guaranteed from the start it was going to be visually impressive. Was it vastly more? Was it vastly more visually impressive than other games of its kind? Not necessarily. I think that games like Overwatch went for a slightly more cartoonish look to them, which probably is. It was most likely a design. In fact, I guarantee it's a design choice, and it's clearly been a very successful design choice. What I think will be a big boost for it was towards the end of the pitch or the end of the presentation. Cliff Bleszinski announced that the price point was going to be $29.99 and struck a joke that people are tired of the $60 multiplayer only shit, as he put it. So next up, we have Killing Floor 2, the new summer sideshow. So Killing Floor and Killing Floor 2 are kind of renowned as pretty off-the-wall, wacky, kind of horror comedy, like survival wave shooter kind of things. But it's going to be set in a kind of a crazed carnival setting. They showed a trailer that seemed to go down well with the audience, where it was almost like a tour of this carnival, and dubbed over it was sort of a sane person's reaction to this carnival full of clowns with chainsaws and people on fire and stuff. It was quite an amusing trailer. I'd imagine it's up online, so I'd recommend having a watch of it. But I think it's definitely something fans will get excited about, and that's going live on the 13th of June. So next up is the newest addition to the Total War series, Total War Warhammer 2. So they're going to be making their second departure from the sort of historical real-world scenarios for the world of Warhammer. This comes from Creative Assembly, obviously known as the creators of the Total War series. Visually, the game looks absolutely stunning. There wasn't a huge amount of in-game footage shown. I felt like a lot of the sort of teaser footage was pre-rendered. But if history's anything to go by, I would expect performance issues on machines that aren't really on the higher end of specs. It's kind of been an ongoing issue. I wouldn't say an issue necessarily, but it's been an ongoing... No, I'm going to go with issue. Sod it. With the Total War games, that they tend to have performance issues given the sort of grand scale of the battles, and when you go from when you enter a battle that is sort of 10,000 versus 10,000 plus, it can really cause a lot of chugging and performance issues. Maybe they've addressed that with this. How they're going to achieve that is anyone's guess. Whether it's going to be one that I'll buy, I am a fan of the Total War games, but I prefer the games that are set in the more historical setting. I'm not crazy about Warhammer. For Warhammer fans, it's probably going to be ideal. But that is out on September the 28th this year. So next up is the War of the Chosen expansion for XCOM 2. So in a slightly different tone to previous XCOM games, or even the current XCOM 2 itself, they appear to be going in a more sort of narrative-driven direction with this one. And it's something that has been asked for from XCOM games in the past, so it's probably something that's going to please a lot of people. So they're adding several new factions and classes. One of the ones they showed, for example, was this might be a controversial one because it appears to be almost like a zombie race called the Lost. But in addition to them, they showed some more sort of enigmatic factions like the Templars and the Reapers, which were more kind of in keeping with the sort of types of factions you would generally see appear in XCOM. So they showed kind of an adapting and evolving Chosen character, a character called the Chosen, that's going to feature heavily in the story through apparently several encounters, but they didn't go into too much more detail than that. So it looks like a promising expansion overall. I'd be slightly wary of the claim that it's twice the size of the previous expansions, but that's going to be out on August the 29th. So the next one was quite an exciting one. The next one was BattleTech. So this is a game that was partially funded by a developer and then ran a successful Kickstarter campaign. It's a turn-based strategy game that's set in the world of the tabletop game BattleTech. And it features, the gameplay centers around kind of commanding a small, what's called a mech lance in the game, which is a squad of these humanoid mechs. So the mechs are, from what we can see, they showed relatively extensive gameplay. They're customizable to a level that is unusual for this type of game, like right down to specific internal parts that can affect mobility, speed, and armor values. And then there's a skill tree system on top of that to grant sort of overall buffs to the mechs. The combat itself looks like it revolves around strategic movement around what look to be pretty expansive maps, and it's coupled with a focus on fine targeting of enemies, similar to, I want to say it's similar to the VAT system in Fallout, but it's it's considerably more involved than that. But the idea being you want to move strategically around the enemies on these huge, well, I say, yeah, huge maps. To get strategic lines of sight on them so you can target these weak points and expose chinks in their armor to break their armor apart and destroy their armor and really fuck their shit up. Overall, it looks like a sure bet for fans of mech warfare games. And it's going to be out on mid to late 2017 was the time frame given on that one. So the next thing announced, or the next thing on my list in the sea of announcements, was the Intel Esports Grand Slam. So they didn't go into a massive amount of detail of the exact dates and nature of this contest, but Intel have announced they're going to be holding an Esports Grand Slam event, which consists of a series of smaller events. And it's obviously modelled on the traditional sports awards of the same name, like in tennis and rugby and things like that. So they're promising the winning team. So the contest promises the winning team, which is stated to be the first team that can win 4 events out of the 10 or so contests that are going to make up this tournament, a $1 million reward. So that's likely to be highly contested among esports teams with a prize that high. I mean, prizes do go that high in esports, but it's relatively rare. I mean, it's significant enough to be something that they're going to go for aggressively. And I think the hope is that that's going to become an annual contest in the future based on the success of this year's event. So next up we have Forza 4, which looks to be a visually amazing racer. It's touted to run at resolutions of up to 4K with an unlocked frame rate. Now the hardware required to achieve that is likely going to be at the very highest end. We're talking 1080 Ti's in SLI with any likelihood. It even has a newer i5 CPU as the minimum CPU requirement. So we're talking high spec requirements here to hit that top performance. With the fact that it's an option, it's pretty damn good. And when you see it running in the trailers they presented, running at 4K at an unlocked frame rate, you can really see the results and the advantage you will get from that kind of investment. But really, it's whether your bank account will handle that investment. And personally, for me, I don't think I could afford to shell out that kind of money. But if you have, I think you're going to be in for a visually thrilling experience. And you will be able to play it for yourself in late 2017. No more solid date was given. So next up, this one was one I was kind of torn about. This is an indie title called The Last Night. It looked visually awesome, but for me, from what was presented in the video, that was really all we had to go on. And even the dev didn't seem that excited about it. I mean, maybe he was just nervous or something like that, but at the start of the presentation, he suddenly started apologizing for something, and I couldn't quite catch what he was apologizing for. And that kind of put me on the back foot, like, okay, why are you starting this with an apology? But okay, on we go. Maybe you pissed some people off, I don't know. It actually originated from a Cyberpunk game jam, and it won best overall out of the 265 entries in that jam, so I might be doing it a bit of a disservice here. It uses a hybrid of 2D and 3D visuals, so it looks like multi-layered 3D environments with these 2D characters sort of overlaid and inserted into it, which is quite an interesting visual style. I mean, it looks incredibly pretty. They stated that it takes inspiration from Flashback and Another World, and I would definitely agree that I can see those influences there. It looks kind of like a point-and-click puzzle-solving adventure. And they had this idea that the world is agnostic of what you're doing, so the events in the world happen in real time regardless of what you're doing, so the actions you take in the game are going to be affected by when you choose to do them and what events are happening at a given time, which again I think is an awesome idea. But they didn't really show much of the gameplay, so I couldn't really put that into any kind of context. So next up we have Griftlands, which had an appealing sort of cartoon style and a lot of gameplay snippets shown that had plentiful dialogue and animated grunts and things. But there wasn't really much indication of the plot or the setting, and it looked to be somewhat based on the older Final Fantasy games, so that was really all I could get. Obviously it had a lot more visual finesse than those kind of games, and the artwork looked absolutely stunning, this kind of hand-drawn style, similar to games like The Whispered World, for example, but obviously it's more RPG setting. I got the impression this is more of a teaser, and unfortunately it really didn't give me too much to go on in terms of details of what the game's about, what the setting's like, what your character's goals are. Really it was almost just like a teaser for the art style. The actual combat seemed to be somewhere between, bizarrely, the early Final Fantasy games and the Stick of Truth. Next up was Tunic. My notes on this were a little bit harsh, and thinking back on it, I probably should have given it more credit. So Tunic, it's an isometric style game, and you play as a pretty cool little fox character. On further research, they didn't really go into too much detail in the presentation. It's a rebranding of a previously unreleased game. I think the reason this one suffered in terms of its presentation was they just, like a couple of other games in this show, they presented them too early and without any kind of grounding context of people being aware of the game. It's not out until early 2018, and the trailer really didn't tell us much about the game's story, the game mechanics. It all felt a little bit cobbled together, and it really stuck out as a trailer that was maybe rushed to get in time for E3. But it felt kind of flat for me, which is a shame because visually it looks like quite a cute little game, and it has some potential. But I just think they've put it out there too early with too few details, and really they would have benefited from waiting, giving us a larger reveal for it with more variety of gameplay shown and more grounding for the setting. So the next one was Obletz. This was one that my notes just say fuck whatever the hell that was. Maybe I'm going in too harsh. It appears to be some kind of Animal Crossing type game. I guess the reason that it really didn't interest me is it's really not a game that is aimed at me. It appears to be some kind of pet / monster breeding / raising / not even battling, I guess, just monster raising, monster rearing game, combined with sort of farming and resource gathering and home building and stuff. It's really not my kind of game. And I think you might benefit from getting a review from someone who is more into this type of game, but just the art style I found a bit obnoxious. It just felt overall just unappealing to me. So finally, aside from Destiny 2 coming to the PC, which I thought was already announced, so I don't know why. I don't know where I got that idea, but I thought it was already announced, but it's been announced now. And finally, the big reveal, the one they couldn't talk about all session or all conference, was to be a new announcement from Microsoft Game Studios. And it was Age of Empires Remastered. The biggest tumbleweed moment for me was that they had saved up to the end of the show, and what they had to show was Age of Empires Remastered. Now, there are a lot of religious fans of Age of Empires, but is that really what you finished the conference with? Is it really that big of a deal? Some people would say yes. I would say, really, you could have done a lot better to finish out the conference with that. You could have finished with LawBreakers, for example. That game had so much more to show in terms of content, instead of just showing us, here's Age of Empires again, but with HD graphics. And the score they showed did sound amazing. I'll give it that. That symphonic score. But really, finishing up a conference with a remaster just fell kind of flat for me. I mean, it's not a game I'm a huge fan of anyway, but it just kind of put a sort of a finish on the conference that overall just left it sort of trailed off and kind of, okay, that's kind of cool. But was that really your big reveal? Is that what you've been teasing since the start of the conference? Yeah, as you can probably tell, I was a little bit deflated by that. But if you're an Age of Empires fan, it's fantastic. You get it in HD and you can play it again, as if you couldn't already play the original. I'm probably not going to make myself a lot of fans. So this has been the Kid at Red Gaming Tech with my roundup of the PC Gamer event at E3 2017. Post me a comment if you disagree with me, if you now hate me, if you now want my blood, or maybe if you want to take me out on a date or something, I don't know. And I will be talking to you again soon. Hope you've enjoyed it. Have a good one.